Welcome everyone. This is a panel discussion around a range of topics: enrollment, retention, job readiness, and how we can better address higher education skills gap in the evolving job marketplace. This event is co-hosted by Aspirability, that's the organization I'm with, and Ease Learning. We have Lori Polito, my colleague. We're the CEOs of our respective organizations and happy to be with you here today. And we're super excited to have, wow, that was a bad slide management. But we're super excited to have our guest with us today. Dr. Andrew Jones will be joining shortly. He's CEO of Creating Futures. He's a multi-time college and university president and chancellor. We have Munize Kabir, who is currently senior director of technology strategy and transformation at Genesis, but has a deep background in talent and management leadership at tech companies, including Amazon Web Services. And we also have Janet Williams, faculty coordinator. Is that North Orange County? Is that what NOCE stands for?
North Orange Continuing Education.
Oh, North Orange Continuing Ed. So we're glad to have her here. We are going to record this session, and we will be sending you a link of the recording for your review later. If you have any issues with the audio, on the bottom left of the screen, it shows a microphone. You can click there to find call-in instructions and whatever else. And if you need other help, maybe you can throw that in the chat and we'll have somebody watching to try to help you out there. So I think we are ready to jump in. I already did some introductions of our panelists. We're hoping Andrew will join shortly. But in the meantime, maybe Janet, if first you just want to add on anything I said about what you do, what your work is, and what your interest in this topic is.
Absolutely. Thank you. I am the distance education faculty coordinator for North Orange Continuing Education. We do focus on post-secondary non-credit education. And within that, we do have a range of CTE certificates for folks that would like to get a non-credit certificate to move into the job place. We also have programs such as an adult high school diploma program, adult basic skills. Within our institution, anything distance ed, I provide support on.
Awesome. Thank you. And Munize, would you like to do the same?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, John. As you said, my name is Munize and I'm currently at Genesis, and my role includes workforce transformation and organizational and talent strategy. So that's definitely why I'm particularly interested in the employer shift to competency-based hiring as well as performance management. And as John mentioned, also have experience at other companies working on the other side of it, trying to help prepare students and recent grads for the workforce.
Thank you. Well, we'll hope Andrew joins us, but we'll go ahead and jump in. Lori, do you want to maybe kick off with a question or two for our panelists, and we can just kind of go back and forth with our conversation?
Sure. So let's see, where should we begin? I guess, we have both sides represented here. We have higher education as well as a workforce lens, and we're defining what is a gap. I'd like to hear from your perspectives, your collective perspectives, what you define that gap to be and how it's impacting you. May as well start laying it out from the beginning.
Sure, I can start. So, from an employer lens, and as John mentioned, I've been at Amazon, so that's one of the world's largest employers, and now I'm at a privately held software company, and the problem statement is the same, which is that we have many more openings than we do a supply of talent, particularly in the technology space. So just to clarify, because I work within CIO or IT organizations, we're often looking for, technical talent, including software engineers, cybersecurity folks, everything on that gamut. And so what ends up happening for us is, we're posting lots of jobs and we don't either necessarily get enough people who apply, or maybe the folks with the right skills don't apply. And I've often found that this is for a couple reasons. I think a lot of times employers don't necessarily set the right expectations in terms of what they're looking for from their candidates. And that's everywhere from the job description all the way to the kinds of questions that are asked, because they don't necessarily assess, right, for a competency in the hiring process. And so that creates a lot of churn throughout the both candidate experience and also the hiring experience from the employer lens. That's just one very small angle to this. I think the problem is pretty widespread. And so what ends up happening is you have a lot of imbalances between supply and demand, particularly in the technology space. And that's just one of many gaps I think that we'll chat about today, but I'll start with that.
Yeah, maybe this is a quick follow-up. What are the kinds of gaps you see? Are they mostly technical? Are they enabling skills? Is it a combination of the two?
Yeah,
That's
it's
a great
definitely a
follow-up.
combination. And I think, a lot of times what happens is, particularly for technical skills, it's so competitive in the marketplace, right? So you have, I would say it's almost a candidate or employees market right now, especially in technology, because they can command higher salaries because they know they're in demand and they know they can jump from company to company. And so
Right.
I think, that ends up creating one problem. And I think the other part of it is, from you called it enabling skills, so we'll use that language. The enabling skills perspective, sometimes, particularly in the technology space, there are folks who might be one and not the other. And so what ends up happening is you have employers who decide that they would rather hold out for that unicorn and maybe let other candidates pass through the pipeline, who could have been great options for them had they decided to bring them on and maybe help close that gap. But it ends up kind of creating this interesting tug of war.
So this kind of all or nothing mentality maybe makes you miss out on people who could have been like an 80 or 90% fit.
That's right.
And then you end up with an empty chair.
That's right.
So Janet, I think it would be great to hear the perspective of preparing students for the job market and what that looks like from your perspective, what the challenges are.
Sure. We live and die by metrics in higher education. Unfortunately, I don't think those metrics measure the right thing. In my opinion, we talk a lot about transitioning. Are students transitioning from high school to a 2-year or 4-year institution? Are they transferring or transitioning from a 2-year to a 4-year? Certificates, that sort of thing. But we focused on the movement, not necessarily are they truly prepared to be successful at that next level. We talk in terms of how many credits are needed to earn a certificate or a degree, but we aren't measuring those individual, very discrete skills effectively to determine, does that degree mean what we truly say it means, in terms of, do you have the skills that you need for Beniza to put you right to work and have a great employee, and the opportunities to move forward, acquire more skills? And that, I think, exists for a lot of reasons. Number one, funding, especially within public institutions. That's not what the state asks us to measure. So that's not the biggest priority. We're measuring the things that we get funded for. The other thing, and it was very shocking to me, I started my career in K-12. And in a K-12 setting, there is a lot of focus in teacher training programs on designing curriculum and measuring outcomes. How do we write outcomes that can be measured? When I transitioned into higher education, it was shocking to me to find out that as long as you're an expert in your discipline, you're an instructor. There's no requirement that you have that training in pedagogy or andragogy to understand how do I effectively convey the knowledge that I have so students can acquire the skills that they need? So those are just two of the areas where I see pretty big gaps.
Thank you. I think maybe we have Andrew dialing in. Can we hear you, Andrew?
Yes, I am dialing in because I can't seem to get in any other way.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for rolling with the punches. So we were just asking our panelists kind of the first question, which is sort of big picture. What do you see as the disconnect between post-secondary and employment? And from your kind of unique perspective, at least in the context of this group, where you've served not only as an institutional leader, but as a broader leader, groups of institutions. What challenges are there at that level, getting people to pay attention to and actually address the gap between post-secondary and workforce?
Well, I think that there's no lack of attention. I think that the problem has been historically that we haven't either had the tools, or I would argue the will, to remedy the problem. I mean, we've had all kinds of challenges around, collective bargaining agreements, alignment of curricular training with competency requirements of employers, which I think is the biggest one that we still have to deal with. And we need a verifiable way to be able to measure competencies and skills of students after they've gone through a training program, whether it's a very specialized one or a general industry kind of approach, and what the day-to-day requirements are for a job. I think that's still one of the biggest gaps. So
it's not only will, like there may be some reasons why faculty and academic leaders don't want to engage, but even when they do, maybe they're missing the right data and information to act on that will effectively.
Yes, absolutely. I think that very often, the data is opaque and it's incomplete. Sometimes it's inaccurate. I mean, one of the big issues that we still see is job descriptions that don't really reflect what the prospective student or employee needs to do. And so you have a job description out there, which in many cases, educational institutions, training institutions are relying on to put curriculum in place to prepare students, and it is inaccurate, which creates the first hurdle. And then you may have subsequent issues between the recruiter and hiring manager and the supervisor on the floor. There's no congruency among them in terms of what the expectations should be.
Well, and I imagine that's compounded either at a department, college, institution, or system level, where not only do you have an inaccurate description from one employer, but now you're looking across all of these employers.
An industry. You might be looking across industry and having the same kinds of issues. And it's just not affordable for most colleges to customize a curriculum for a company.
Got it.
So we really need to be looking at it from an industry lens, and then trying to come up with as many commonalities across that industry as we can, and hopefully working with specific companies to reskill, upskill, whatever we need to do to make sure that whatever the gap between the industry curriculum and the specific company requirements are met.
I have a question for the group, and I want to put this question out there to each of you to answer. I'm hearing threads of we need a common taxonomy, and there's a lot of organizations out there trying to create exactly that, industry-wide taxonomies. There's Open Skills Network. There's a whole variety, right? We also have been bouncing around the word competency. And there's a whole science behind learning design, and that's our background at East Learning, and thinking about competency-based learning and structuring that pedagogically and thinking about how to even create that kind of learning. And I know that sometimes faculty are not trained in pedagogy. They're trained in their discipline. And then we have access to employers. So I'm hearing a multitude of reasons why there's this gap. I'm curious from your respective lenses, which one of those is the greatest pain point? Or is it just a combination for you? And I'll flip that from the workplace perspective. Instead of access to employers, it might be access to programs that understand what you need. So I think that's an interesting triangulation to think about the compounding of all of that and how it's affecting your respective positions. I also just want to mention, if as a panelist, if you have questions, as an attendee, if you have questions you'd like to ask panelists, please feel free to type those in to the chat while we're addressing this question. Let's start with, whoever wants to go first.
I'd like to hear Manise talk about this a little bit.
Sure. I think your question is which of these things is the worst or most impactful. And for me, I have to say it's a combination. On the employer side, I'm starting to see, which is great, a shift towards competency-based models. I mean, when I was at Amazon Web Services, John and the Aspire to Ability team did an awesome job of helping us learn to speak that language. And I think, what it did was not just help us think about hiring, but also career mobility within the organization. It gave us a common language to say, okay, if I'm in this job and I'm trying to move to this other job, what is that gap? And by the way, how do I close it? Right. So I think that's helpful. I do think that employers, because they're not asking the right questions, it's hard to then be upset that you feel like certain degree programs or universities or other non-traditional educators aren't meeting your needs, because I think you have to start with the outcome and then work backwards, right? So ideally you would say, these are the competencies or outcomes that I'm looking for in an employee. And then working backwards from there, which programs are a good fit for me? And how then do I help onboard folks in a way that closes gaps that will exist no matter what? Because an educator won't necessarily prepare employees for a specific company, right? You'll get close, particularly in technology, right? You might have the right skills or knowledge to be able to do a certain thing with a coding language, right? But then there are so many nuances to corporate organizations, whether it's an industry specific one or, there's context that matters. And so there's always going to have to be a burden on the employer to say, okay, well, how then do I enable my employees to be successful, regardless of what skills and competencies they're coming in with and where I think the gap is. So it's hard to say any one of these things is a problem, but I do think the responsibility is shared.
Awesome. Janet, do you have thoughts?
My first thought is D, all of the above, based on the list of choices that Lori gave. It's definitely a combination of things. We do have a large number of instructors who are interested in looking at the misalignment, from an individual course level, maybe through a program, certificate, degree. But unfortunately, as Lori mentioned, then we're talking a completely different skill set. We're talking instructional design, not discipline area. And so while we can support instructors in making progress in that, we're asking them to become experts in a completely different discipline. And then that changes the working conditions. And then we're having a conversation about compensation or job duties. And I'm not a fan of asking faculty to work for free. We already take on so many other responsibilities that adding this other layer becomes a challenge. And then it also becomes a question of resources. If we have faculty who are willing, how do we get them the training, the support, the infrastructure to move forward with it? How do we compensate them for taking on these extra job duties? And it snowballs from there. So yeah, it's definitely a combination of issues that lead to the gap that we're talking about.
Well, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, so what's the motivation for change?
Yep. We're thinking the same thing.
Yeah. what motivates us to close this gap? It's obviously something that's impacting both the student.
Like in each
students
of your
first and
concepts,
foremost, right? They're paying all this money. They're going into debt. I just had a chat with someone from an organization that is now selling to higher education insurance for closing the wage gap for students. So they have this debt. They're trying to get a certain salary when they graduate. They're actually buying insurance policies now because they can't get the salary they're expecting. I mean, it's I didn't even know such a thing existed, but it does. So how do we help them transition from this investment they're making, the return that they want to see? How much of that is even driving enrollments to decline? Are they losing the value proposition in what we're offering? What is the catalyst to motivate us to do something about this?
Yeah. So like you laid out like this gargantuan problem. We've talked about it. So in each of your contexts, who cares enough to actually do something about that?
We just discussed a million obstacles, right? So
Right,
what's
right.
the solution? How do we solve this?
I think it depends on who you ask. If you're asking a college president or a district chancellor, then they understand that there are very, very serious fiscal implications for not figuring this out.
Right.
If you talk to faculty and staff, then it becomes a student-centered question. Can I, as an educator, say that I am student-centered and not make this shift? Because there's a huge disconnect between my words and my actions if I don't. So I think as an educator, it's challenging my colleagues in, are we doing right by our students? Number one. And if we're not doing our dead level best, what do we need to change and how quickly can we change it? And we have to hold each other accountable. Or again, we don't have the right to say we're student-centered.
So in higher ed, it's different different answers depending on
what level you're talking to within the organization. We're having very serious conversations within our institution, within our district. The California community college system as a whole is asking itself, why are we down in enrollment? What's happening?
Yeah.
And so if you ask that question of someone that is primarily responsible for the fiscal health of the institution, their concern is different. If you're asking a faculty member that's in the classroom and is seeing students struggle or seeing students leave their course unprepared for the next course or what happens after they earn their degree, then the action that we would take to solve that issue is going to be very different. So I think at each level, we have to figure out, are we asking the right question?
Yep.
And once we get an answer, what do you plan to do about it? And that's going to take some pushing within education. We don't always shift very quickly.
Right.
We're going to have to if we want to remain a viable solution for students in advancing their careers.
So Andrew, from your chair as a former president, chancellor, vice chancellor, let's say you had this epiphany, like, wow, we have to fix this. What levers? I mean, we know there's a lot of barriers that would get in the way of you actually implementing that with a system or a district or school. But what are some examples of what has worked? What do you see as glimmers of hope?
Well, I think that close communication between institutions and employers is critical. And I think California has the right idea in terms of this regional approach to that. Now, in practice, people could argue that it hasn't worked the way it was projected to work. But at the same time, unless there's a very close alignment between what institutions are offering and whether it's credit, non-credit, some credential that has some verifiable means of validation and that is linked to some kind of employer expectation, then we're blowing in the wind. I mean, we've got to have really close communications with employers. We need to know very specifically what they need, what they want, and we have to be realistic about it. I mean, I think Joanne, I think, talked about it from the resource perspective. A lot of support for these companies and whatnot require huge resources and redeployment of staff and all kinds of things that most institutions don't have. And we've been fortunate to some extent in getting prospective employers to provide equipment, sometimes executives on loan, all kinds of things. But I think that's the kind of fundamental building block we have to have, and if we're really going to make the required change that we have to make. Because the other issue that we don't control is, what about all the disruptive innovations and disruptive technology that's entering into the equation? How does that factor in? So you've got a program that's going well, but now there's something on the horizon that changes that. How quickly are you going to be able to shift using institutional resources? Well, at least in the places I've been, not very, because we didn't have a lot of surplus dollars to shift to a specific industry or even a whole workforce mechanism. What we need is very close alignment with employers, with industry leaders. And oh, by the way, there's some policy implications about all this too that we haven't begun to talk about yet.
No, that's a great perspective.
John, I can share a kind of anecdote of how I've seen this work well, exactly what Andrew's talking about. I mean, I sit on an employer advisory board at the University of Houston's College of Technology, and there's literally a group of folks from the Houston technology community, CIOs, other levels as well. And we provide very direct feedback to the faculty as well as other university administrators around what it is we're looking for. And I've been very brutally honest with them about, here's what I've observed when interviewing your students. Here's what I see as a gap. And then they do things like address curriculum. They create student engagement programs. So they'll have mentors assigned from the Houston technology community to the students to provide career guidance. We'll do mock interviews. You know, it's like a whole series of things. And the truth is, we do this work as the employers for free, because the what's in it for us is we get a preview of this talent. So rather than me sifting through a ton of resumes and not knowing who's who, I've actually spent now a full academic year getting to know these students, some as soon as they're sophomores. And then by the time they're seniors, I've actually hired them into my organization. And so, you know, I think there are the group that advises at the school is part of the Society for Information Management, which is a professional networking group.
Right.
But I do think there are other opportunities for professional networking groups to get involved with, you know, different higher educational institutions, because there is a clear benefit for them, and it works.
That's great.
So we have a question in the chat. Let's see.
Yeah, you want me to read?
Go ahead, John. I'm sorry, I'm having a technical. It won't let me scroll for some reason.
That's okay. So Leah says, Manise mentioned that she connects Houston College to the gaps she's seen in their students. What are some examples of those gaps that you're sharing?
Great question. The biggest gap that I noticed was that the students would have a theoretical understanding of technical concepts, but could not demonstrate that they knew how to do anything. And so what I noticed, and the difference was with the University of Houston, a higher ranking school, is I had also visited a school in the Rio Grande Valley, the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And I visited the equivalent degree program, and the students were significantly better prepared in interviews because they were doing the opposite of that. They could actually very clearly demonstrate that they knew how to execute the concept. And what I learned the difference was in the teaching approach. So for the students at the University of Houston,
100%.
And then the students at UTRGV, they actually had no lectures. It was all labs. And not only that, every 2 to 3 weeks, the students were asked to present, you know, what they were working on, because that built up their communication skills, and it showed in interviews.
I want to comment on this because my background is learning design, right? And we strive when we work with higher ed to help faculty understand active learning versus passive learning. And I can't emphasize this enough. That is how skills are practiced. And I just thank you so much for that validation, because that is the biggest challenge we face, is the time that it takes. And it's an investment, the time that it takes to be able to work through curriculum. And we've worked extensively with Janet and her team to think about more active types of learning. I wonder how many are struggling with that. Maybe in the panel, in the chat, if the attendees would want to comment on that, because I think that the practice and the application is missing. My other question to you all is hard skills versus soft skills. I think that sometimes taking a hard skill and applying it brings out all the soft skills. I think there's an interchange between those two things. So I'd be curious what you're finding the biggest deficiency to be. Is it the hard skills or is it the soft skills?
Well, I'm not on the employer side, but I can tell you what I've heard from employers, and I think it's a combination. But I think it often plays out this way. So there's a corporate culture, and many of the students, particularly students coming from community colleges, have not had the kinds of internships that expose them to the realities of the corporate world. So a student goes in, first generation maybe, college student, no legacy there, and there's some expectation that this student is automatically going to know how to thrive in that environment. So I hear that a lot, that, students don't know how to do this, and students didn't recognize that, and this kind of thing. So I think that's a both soft skills and hard skills issue, to the extent that I've got hard skills, but I'm not going to get a chance to perhaps display them because I'm not fitting into this new ecosystem.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think those opportunities to actually be in that culture are vital. And there is absolutely an aspect of access around that, 100%. How do you think we might be able to open that up more? How can we create more opportunities like that?
Well, I think one thing is we've got to find a way to get more internships, and particularly paid internships. Sometimes there are internships programs available, but they create hardships for students. Many of our students, 2 and 4 year, work. Some have families, have other kinds of obligations. They simply cannot afford to do a non-paid internship.
Right.
But they tend to be fairly few and far between. And if you're talking about an institution with 3 or 4 or 5 or 1,000 students or more, not all of the students are obviously going to get internships. Perhaps many of them don't need them, but those who want them probably don't have access to a paid internship. So I think some way that we can formulate ways through philanthropic, through employer contributions, through perhaps even state or federal contributions to set up internship programs that allow
development stuff, right, Andrew?
I'm wondering if it's a financial barrier or if it's a barrier of not knowing how to quantify the credentials that someone may be has emerging. So perhaps someone is in a program and they're developing skills, but they're not fully baked, right? Yeah. And they want to get an internship. Is it from the employer lens? I'm curious if you could tell us, is it a difficulty in quantifying the skills that somebody is fostering to know if they could be useful within an organization in a paid internship, or is it more of a funding issue?
It's going to depend on the organization, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhere like Amazon, where you have robust resources and really rigorous internship programs, I mean, it's not a funding issue, but I think what Andrew was saying is so interesting. I think this is where you ask employers to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to diversity and equity and inclusion. Because if you're going to sit here and say, we're monitoring DEI, we care about, having folks from XYZ communities, but then you exclude people in the process because they're not speaking corporate culture, corporate language.
Right.
You have to really look at yourself and say, am I doing this for the right reasons? And so, I recognized the same gap. I knew that I was hiring students from primarily colleges that have first generation college students. And so we actually had a sort of semi immersion program that once they were, onboarded, we had they were like a sort of reskill or upskill organization that came in and did a few things for us. One was immersing them in a sort of technology environment. We did a 2-day hackathon where we put them on teams and they kind of had to do the thing, right, of being technologists. And so that helped them see how going from the classroom to a corporate environment was a little bit different in terms of the actual work. But then that same gentleman who was a facilitator for the day also took them to a dinner where they practiced kind of, table manners and corporate speak. And, it was this experience where they felt safe because they were with other students coming from similar backgrounds and no one was judging them. And, to be honest, no matter where you come from, I think the first few years of corporate life is all about how do I be a professional? I mean, even students from top schools with a lot of exposure to this corporate culture, it's still awkward when you show up to your first day of work. I mean, you're wondering basic things like, when do I go to lunch? And is someone going to tell me that like I can't leave or go to the restroom? There's just like basic things that you don't know when you have your first job. And I think having that level set is really important. And I think this is where, a lot of folks can ask employers to say, look, if you are serious about having folks from all different communities in your organization, then you have to understand that that requires you filling the gap.
Yeah.
If we're talking.
I was just going to chime in really quick. So it's interesting that, I think all of you have talked about the concept of backward design, starting with what success looks like. What's a well-rounded, ready-to-work employee look like? What does a graduate look like who's ready to go compete? With specific regard to the internships, externships, apprenticeships, I was talking to somebody yesterday who runs a large apprenticeship program. One of the problems they have is they have multiple schools and faculty involved. And so there's not consensus about what the competencies are that somebody should be acquiring in that internship. And very often it's not even discussed at all. It's just, hey, go do some work. We hope something magical happens and you come back with more skills. So this is more of a comment than a question, but would love your reactions to it. But I think one of the challenges to fix, and Lori, back to your point, drive paid internships is having very specific activities that the student will engage in and the competencies that they're supposed to be acquiring by doing that. Does that resonate?
I think you actually were reading my mind, John, because that's where I was going to go with that. From a curricular standpoint, there does have to be some intentionality as to what the goal of the internship or externship is. And for the most part, that doesn't really exist. But then that's going to require collaboration with our partners who can then ensure that the student is meeting XYZ criteria so that they can receive the credit for it. But
and they're having the experiences they need to acquire those, right?
Exactly. So there has to be preparation. And then once we send a student out into that work environment, then we have to ensure that that partner is going to make sure that the student at least has the opportunity to try whatever it is we want them to be able to attempt during the internship experience. But I wanted to speak to Andrew's point about the equity of opportunity. I fell into that category when I was doing my teaching credential. There's no way I could have worked a semester for free. There's just there's not. And that presents a huge disparity for a lot of students. I just got lucky that California had a huge teaching shortage, so I was able to do my student teaching on an emergency credential, and the stars don't align for everyone like that. But if we're talking about what can we do now, because I feel like this is a house is on fire situation, something has to give. soon. It doesn't even have to be, immediately how do we change the culture or the expectations around internships. From a curriculum standpoint, from a faculty standpoint, I can build smaller experiences into my course. Go find someone in your interview or in your field and interview them. Do a presentation about it. So we have multiple experiences being shared within the course. Maybe we elevate that to just a shadowing day. And this is what I want you to look for as you observe both the behaviors when we're talking about that corporate speak and professional etiquette. Observe the behaviors and observe the skills that you should be learning within this program. And that's not that big a shift from a curriculum standpoint, but then we have to find, again, those partners that will create meaningful experiences for our students, regardless of the length of the experience, so they can get what they need to come back and earn the grade, demonstrating that they've acquired the skills.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah, and then on the flip side of that, going back to what Joanne said earlier, most faculty are very, very competent with regard to their discipline.
Yeah.
Many faculty have never taken teacher education courses. You can argue one way or the other on that. But I would argue that the solution might be something as simple as an externship, where we begin to form relationships with companies and we're sending our faculty to those companies so that they, in fact, can get not only just practical experience, but they can also experience that corporate culture.
So running the faculty through that experience, that's interesting.
Yeah, because then what we have is somebody who has a recent, a current, a relevant experience to the parts of their students. And that sometimes doesn't happen, particularly with regard to that three-legged stool where, we're talking about the competencies, the experience, and, the relevancy to a particular industry or sector.
Andrew, this is Janet. I'd love to chime in on that real quick. I think that's a very valid issue. I did some time in the private sector as well. I did work for private companies, but it's been a while. And I think that's very common among higher education, that even if you worked in the private sector, if we're talking about technology skills, especially 2 years out of the field, 5 years out of the field, once you start getting to 10 and 20 years outside of that private sector in certain fields, that's a lifetime. And yet those are the people that are still writing the curriculum for these students, expecting them to be prepared.
It's almost like you're a historian of technology rather than a practitioner.
Exactly.
And I would go one step further and say not just the faculty should be immersed, but also the folks who are dispensing career advice to the students. I can't tell you how many career centers I've had to correct or sell a product to when I was on the other side of this equation, to say, have you ever had a job in a professional organization? Have you ever had this kind of job? No? Well, then maybe you shouldn't be telling your students to write these cover letters when I'm telling you that I'm receiving these and I'm going to throw them away because those are like an ancient artifact. So, it kind of cuts both ways, that it's the faculty for sure, but then also whoever else is around the students in that network to say, like, this is actually what people look for when they're screening your resumes.
That's fascinating. We're getting on the home stretch. Would love any questions from the attendees, if there's any you want to drop in the chat.
I was actually going to suggest two things from an attendee perspective. I think pose a problem that you are trying to solve that's relevant to what we're talking about, and maybe also a solution.
Yeah, and if we don't get to it, reading it out, we'll definitely follow up with you after the session.
Or a question for the panelists.
Yep.
Any of those choices.
While we wait for those to come in, maybe each panelist can give us your, if you we've got King Charles being coronated. If you were coronated as the grand poobah of job and workforce alignment, what would you do? What would you love to see happen?
This is the magic wand question, John.
Yeah.
This is the magic question.
We're dubbing you a magic wand today.
Well, I'll go first. I mean, for me, it would be, it sounds simple, but of course it's not. And that is to have some very, very specific relationships and contracts, perhaps even, but understandings with employers with regard to what it is they're looking for, specific skill sets, if there's a shelf life on those kinds of things, how we factor in those disruptive innovations and technologies we know that are coming, and some kind of long-term commitment from those companies to work with us to make sure that we're assuring that what we're teaching is relevant, is current, and is prospective. So we're looking out into the future, and that there's some guarantee or commitment that they will work with us as we reskill and upskill both our current students and perhaps their prospective employees who then have an opportunity to come back to us when this upskilling and reskilling is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Manisa, you've got to have a bigger idea. I can see the wheels spinning.
I mean, to be honest, coming from the employer lens, I wish more employers, or I guess to rephrase that, what I would fix is I would have every employer completely revamp their hiring practices, because as you know, John, from the work we did at Amazon, they're not asking the right questions and they're not assessing people the right way. So that's everything, like I said, from job descriptions, right? What are you asking for? And I know, because when I ask, our managers for job descriptions and I get what I get, that's when I start to realize, like, oh, you think this is a fun check the box activity. In my mind, I'm like, this is someone's career in their life. So we better ask for stuff the right way. And by the way, is this person even going to be successful if you frame it this way, right? So I'm personally very religious when it comes to how we write those and the kinds of standards and rigor we put around that. I think not everyone should interview. I mean, that's just a reality that people should come to understand, is not everyone is cut out to be an interviewer, not everyone should be. And so the practice of whoever can be a hiring manager should also be looked at, because, not everyone should be a people manager either. So really, I guess what I'm getting at is all employers need to understand that the entire process is broken from start to finish, and that if I had a magic wand, I would fix that.
It's funny. I was talking to a CTO Friday, works with a large healthcare company, and he was saying the biggest problem he has right now is the people that HR and recruiting are sending to him when he has open spots are either grossly underqualified or overqualified.
Mm-hmm.
And the overqualification problem is huge, because he's hiring people who think this is a sophisticated, complex job, and they get bored and quit in 9 months. Check this statistic out. Last quarter, he hired 90 engineers and lost 85.
I'll tell you very quickly, since you brought up HR, is that, the time I've seen it work really well at a career fair, as an example, is when it's not HR going, it's the people doing the work. So when I was in consulting and I worked for Accenture, I had about 80 people on this recruiting team, and only one person was in HR, and her job was to coordinate all the consultants and partners to go out to the schools and to have the conversations with the students. And it's very easy for them to tell a student, what is it like to be in your shoes?
Right, because that's what they're actually doing.
That's right. So that whole mechanism that we have that says HR is a part of the process is part of the problem. And so what employers need to think about is that cycle of work as well, because that's sort of widening a gap that exists. And you're having, when the hiring manager are already not asking the right questions of candidates, you certainly don't want someone who's not even in the same function asking the questions too. So that's definitely something that
Very
that
interesting.
can be addressed.
Janet, do you want to wave a magic wand?
Sure. If I could wave the magic wand, we would completely revamp the funding system for post-secondary education so that there is an incentive to not only make the shift, but to do so rapidly, and that we're actually measuring the outcomes, not just number of degrees, the funding model would then be more focused on, are students prepared? Not just have students earned the certificate, have students earned a diploma or a degree. I think that would make the financial incentive there, but it would also make it easier for the faculty who want to make the shift, but don't have the resources to do so. So I would just start from scratch in that regard in terms of how are we measuring success within higher education and the money that's tied to that definition.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Just to put a fine point on that, let's take two students. One moves through the pipeline, graduates, but doesn't get a job or gets a job where they're underemployed. That's still counted as a success because they graduated. Take student two, who drops out as a junior or senior because she's acquired some pretty great skills and gets a six-figure job aligned with their degree. That's called a failure because she didn't graduate.
And we're not even measuring the skills that student left with.
Exactly.
That allowed her to get that job.
Right.
And there's just a misalignment in terms of, in my opinion, our words versus our actions in higher education. And it goes back to the big question at any level. Are we acting in a student-centered manner?
Lori, do you have...
Do I get to wave a magic wand?
Well, do you have magic wands that actually work? Because if we could get them to those three, I would love all three of those changes.
I mean, I think as a service provider in this space, I hope I have a few magic wands, because otherwise, what am I doing, right?
Yep, for sure.
I mean, I think if I could wave a magic wand, I would create more urgency on this. The process takes too long. Students are missing out, and it's a responsibility that we have to make sure that they're not going to repeat ages 18 to 22. And adults who are trying to pull their life together and progress their career don't have time to wait. We're in a recession. They need help. They need education is where people go to find a pathway to more opportunity. And if we're not providing that, then we're failing these students. And I take that responsibility very seriously with the work that we do. Our magic wand is being able to quantify skills, to be able to connect the curriculum using good design practice, using the tools and technology that we have put into the marketplace. Educating people about how to do those things is the magic wand that we have. But what I see sorely lacking is the urgency. The sales cycle is so slow. Vendors are here to help, and we're trying to provide solutions, and getting through to get all of this aligned is very challenging.
Lori, if I could jump in about the urgency, just to give some context, even if we have the perfect course mapped out, it meets Manisa's ask in terms of employer readiness, it could take as long as a year from the time we start writing the course and send it through the various levels of shared governance and approval until we can actually run that class and have students in it. Yeah. And we know in some industries that year gap, what we're teaching is already out of date. Yeah. So
those two sentences just put my blood pressure up, because
I mean, Janet, even with the work we've done together, how long did it take us to finally get those great courses in front of students?
Almost
I mean, now we have them. It's great. But I'd like to see that at scale. I'd like to see that, impacting and now bringing employers to the conversations is the next piece. And we're starting to do that.
Yeah, and that's our magic wand is.
And that's why we're having this today.
Yeah, and for those if it's not clear, the reason ease and aspirability are partnering on this is because that's the bridge we build is from the great curriculum the Lori and team partner with to build with schools. We're saying, okay, great, let's make sure that's actually aligned with the job marketplace. The one last
Janet, what did you want to say?
Sorry, Janet.
I would love to respond to Robert's comment.
Yeah, it's a great comment.
Robert, I can give you a wonderful example of where it has worked. I am currently, I say I'm the DE coordinator, but I'm a department of one. And so in my desperation to get the resources I need, I decided to go out and enroll in some additional courses. I actually enrolled in an instructional design certificate program through Cal State East Bay's extension program. And it allowed me then to have the option to transfer into their Master of Science in e-learning.
Wow. Okay.
And so their certificates are stacked so that once you've done more than 2 certificates, it's almost a waste of your time and money not to get the full master's degree because it's just 2 more courses. And so it is possible. I've experienced it, but I could not agree more with Robert that should be the standard. There should be a seamless way for me as someone at the midpoint in my career, or even at the tail end of my career, wants to change careers. Can I come in through non-credit? And if I see that this is something I love, this is something I want to commit to, how do I then transition to a credit-bearing class or program?
Yeah, that's a perfect example of you started the conversation today, Janet, talking about transitioning.
Yeah, I love it.
And that's a pathway that actually works. We need more exemplars like that.
Yeah. And we're just about at the end. Any last thoughts from our panelists?
Well, I just think that given what Janet and Lisa just said, one of the big challenges is still around what employers accept. And Lisa could probably speak to this very fluently, but if I'm looking for somebody to come in with a degree, versus am I looking for somebody to come in with verified competencies? And hopefully they would be the same, but all too often we see that they're not.
Yeah.
I mean, I have gone on crusades to remove the requirement to have a college degree from job descriptions at multiple employers now, because we're not asking the right thing. So I think you're exactly right, Andrew.
I don't know if Michelle was trying to post something, but it came across as a string of different letters and numbers.
Is that Klingon? I'm not sure what that was. Janet, any last thoughts?
It's been a great conversation. I think that ultimately, if we could have as many doorways to education so students can come in and out based on where they are in their career or desire to shift in a career, that would be ideal. We gave the example of non-credit to credit, and that's just one doorway in. I would love not only for there to be front door, back door, sideways, through a window, however we get the student in to get the knowledge that they need, whether it's a credit bearing class or not. I would love to see more flexibility so students can get what they need and go out and take care of their families, accomplish their goals, and just do bigger and better things.
There was a question, Janet, from Michelle. It's been translated into English.
Yeah.
Which institution did Janet just mention where she transferred from CE to credit?
Oh, absolutely. It's California State University, East Bay. So it's up north, and this is a fully online program because I live in Southern California. So that made it even easier for me. I never had to leave my house, but not only could I go in from continuing ed and into credit, but they've done a beautiful job of stacking those certificates. And I'll throw that out as a shining example of how it can be done. Thanks for asking though, Michelle.
Well, we're at time. Thank you so much to our panelists and your insights and perspectives. As we mentioned, this is recorded. We'll send all the attendees a link to that recording. and we'll have some additional follow-up information that goes along with this, including, if you're interested, how you would engage with Ease and Aspirability to help your institutions close this gap. Lori, any parting?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm speaking from the Ease Learning perspective. We're all about solving problems. We tailor our services around solving problems. So typically, if we do reach out, it's to say, what are the problems you're having?
Yeah.
And how can we help you? So, that's my closing comment, is just, these are things we're trying to methodically address, and it would be great to understand a little bit more what your pain points are. And we started describing some of the ones here, but I'm sure there's a lot of nuances to that. We would love to hear more.
Absolutely. Well,
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists today. I just, taking the time to have these conversations and to bring this relevancy to the market is huge. So thank you so much for all of your time and thoughtfulness.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for
It's been
having us.
wonderful.
Yeah.